So I was doing that. Pick me up. Go off the screen share. Okay. That's good. Awesome. We're on. Right. I get an extra 2 minutes at the end, right? Okay, right. So yeah, no equations in this talk, I don't think. So yeah, my name is Peter. I'm a computer scientist by training, but I've worked for the last 10 years in epilepsy research. And I work with clinical colleagues from centres around the world to try and come up with better treatments for epilepsy. I have originally a background in dynamical systems, so a lot of this morning did actually make sense to me. But I'm not going to be talking about any of that work today. So with that, you are warned. So yeah, like I said, a lot of my work is to try and help clinicians to treat epilepsy better. And so the question that I've put here is, how can a computer scientist like myself help a neurologist? And also, you'll notice that my slides are all quite top heavy because this morning I redid them all so that they fit on the top half of the screen. So apologies for the top heaviness. So a quick overview. Today I'll give you a background to epilepsy and what you need to know to understand the rest of my talk. And I'll talk about 3 main studies. The first 2 are using DTI networks, connectomics, if you're familiar with those terms. And the third study will use intracranial EEG, so talking about data from patients with epilepsy who have had electrodes implanted into the brain itself. And then I'll close by talking about how we plan to bring this all together for clinical benefit. So part of the motivation for this talk is that epilepsy is really quite common and not well treated currently. So there's around 70 million people with epilepsy, pretty much the whole population of the UK, and a third have uncontrolled seizures. So first line treatment is medication, but in a third of patients, this doesn't work, it doesn't stop seizures. Now, the only potential cure for epilepsy is surgery. And the goal of surgery is to remove the part of the brain that's causing the seizures. Now, in order to do that, you need to be able to identify what part of the brain is causing seizures. And that's obviously not as easy as it might sound. And this figure on the right is a Kaplan-Meier plot, and it's showing how many years after surgery are a proportion of patients that are seizure-free. So immediately after surgery, all patients are seizure-free, day 1 after surgery by definition. And then if you go just 1 year after surgery, about a quarter of patients have relapsed to have seizures again. And when you look at long-term outcomes, about half of patients are still having seizures despite having invasive neurosurgery. So this is a part of the brain that's been chopped out, essentially, to put it too fine. And so you don't want to undergo such an invasive operation if it's not going to work. And in a half of patients, it doesn't work properly. They still have seizures. So essentially the goal of pre-surgical evaluation, so the part before they actually do the operation, is to try and find the focus, essentially. Find the bit of brain that's abnormal and causing seizures. So this is as close to an equation I'll get in my talk. This is essentially a distribution of controls and a patient, and you can calculate a Z-score. So most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is as simple as just computing a Z-score. So how far away from a control distribution is an individual patient in, for example, a brain area? And so there's a few different brain areas, a few different control subjects here. And here's an example patient above. And maybe if you squint, you can see that this part of the hippocampus here in this patient is abnormally small relative to the contralateral hemisphere and relative to control subjects. Now, an experienced radiologist will be able to see this immediately, but you can see how subtle some of these things can be that we're trying to detect. And even this blatant one, this is about as blatant as it gets, can still be considered quite subtle. So a lot of my work is in developing advanced computational techniques to try and pull out these subtle abnormalities in patients. Now, neurosurgery involves the removal of tissue, and just to reiterate, it doesn't always lead to seizure freedom. And I've just put a MRI scan of a patient here who's had a surgery, a temporal lobectomy here, and this is an example of what it looks like after the operation. So it's a pretty substantial part of the brain that's been removed, and I'm trying to kind of iterate the point that it's an invasive operation. This is a big deal. You don't want to be doing this unless it's pretty sure that it's going to work for you. Okay, so hopefully I've motivated the importance of epilepsy and the importance of finding abnormalities and being confident in whatever abnormalities you find, and also integrating the information from the surgery into any predictions of outcome that we make. So I'll move on to the first study, and this was from a few years ago, but I think it sets up nicely the latest studies, and also might be interesting to people who work on networks in brains and changes in networks in brains. So the research questions of this study were to identify or find out which regions and which connections are removed by anterior temporal lobe resection, and that's this bit of brain here, and it could be left or right hemisphere, and that's an example that was shown on the previous slide, which is a pretty substantial resection. Does this vary between patients, and how? Are some patients having larger resections or smaller ones? Does that relate to whether they are seizure-free afterwards or not? Is there any variation? If there is variation, is that predictive of patient outcomes, whether they're seizure-free or not? And so essentially we're asking, what is the impact of surgery on the structural connectome or the structural brain network, and does that relate to outcome? Naively, you might think, okay, bigger resections, you're removing more of the brain, you'd expect the patient to do better. You're removing more connections, you'd expect the patient to do better. So they were the kinds of things we're investigating in this study. So essentially we're calculating the change in connectivity, and what we did is we overlaid the post-operative MRI with the pre-operative MRI to figure out what connections in the brain overlaid with it and what regions overlaid. And this gives an answer to the question of, if I were to reset this tissue in this patient, what would the expected impact or change be to the network, to the brain network? I'll just put a cartoon here to just drive this home. So you might have a pre-operative brain network here with 3 different regions, A, B, C, and connectivity looking something like that in a connectivity matrix. And then you've got a post-operative scan, as shown earlier, and overlay that and draw a mask over what was resected, and then calculate the new expected network expected after the surgery. And then you can do all sorts of graph theoretic metrics on these changes, if you like. Or you could even simulate models on the preoperative, simulate a model on the postoperative network, simulate seizures, simulate whatever you like. And we can look at things like changes in terms of the volumes of these regions, or in terms of the strength, or the connectivity, or any graph theory metric you like. That's the processing pipeline with all the imaging on. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but just suffice to say we use the preoperative and the postoperative, so pre and post surgery scans, to infer this data. This was a retrospective study of 53 patients, so a decent sample size for the field. All patients underwent anterior temporal lobe resection done by the same surgeons with the same scanner and the protocol. Outcome was recorded at 12 months on the ILAE scale, and that essentially just means were they seizure-free or were they not seizure-free. So ILAE 1 means seizure-free, ILAE 2 to 6 means not seizure-free. Basically, a 2 means you've had an improvement after surgery, you've had fewer seizures, whereas a 5, let's say, means you've had no improvement. But basically, anything between 2 and 6, you're still having seizures after surgery. So we categorized it into these 2 groups. Outcome groups were matched for age, sex, and evidence of hippocampal sclerosis and on-site site. And just to note that this could be done prospectively for any kind of intended resection. So you could draw a red mask on any part of the brain and make predictions based on that. So although this is a retrospective study, you could do this prospectively. So the simplest question you could ask is, if I resect more of the brain, is the patient more likely to be seizure-free after the surgery? And so here's the resection masks that you can see here. Hello.
Could you move the zoom thingy?
Oh, I didn't even see that on my screen.
So maybe move it to the far right or far left. So.
It looks different on my monitor. This is not easy.
Sorry.
The answer might be no to that question.
Never mind.
Yeah, I think the answer is no. Sorry. I think it's touchscreen. That would have been nice. Good idea. So the outcome is not trivially related to resection volume. So it's not simply the case that the bigger the resection, the better the outcome. Hello, is that a question?
I may ask, yeah, because the surgeon isn't conducting a study in that sense that he decides to cut out a smaller or bigger volume, right? He looks at the sclerosis and sees how big it is. And then he adapts according to the bigness of the sclerosis, I think, how much he wants to resect. So I don't think you can make that statement.
So the outcome groups were matched in terms of whether they had hippocampal sclerosis or not.
But it can have different area sizes, like that's not a uniform.
Well, the resection was an anterior temporal lobectomy, which is it's about as routine as it gets in epilepsy. The standard resection in epilepsy, Spencer's approach, if you're interested. So they reset the anterior 3/5, I think it is, and also they go as far back to in the hippocampus as I think it's 4/5. And so the surgeon does actually intend to do the same operation every time.
Okay, so they want to do the same volume, but they have different.
Yeah. In this cohort, yeah. It's a great question though, because epilepsy is heterogeneous, and obviously the lesions could be anywhere, right? But yeah, this is particularly a TLE cohort. But great point, good question. Thank you. But for this cohort in TLE, the outcome is not trivially related to the volume. So then you might say, well, if I resect or if I affect more connections, maybe that will relate to outcome. And that was not the case, at least in this cohort again. So I was getting pretty down, to be honest, when I was doing this analysis. I'd hoped that basically the more that you resect, the better that you're going to do. And we can just go to the surgeon and say, well, just tailor your resection such that you cut out the biggest connection bundles. But no, that wasn't the case. But this is on a kind of a more global course level. You can also look at this on an individual region level. And so this is kind of what I'm getting at with this. So all resections are pretty similar, they're intended to be similar. So you can look at, for example, the amygdala. The surgeons are resecting almost all of the amygdala and pretty much all of the temporal pole, TMP. And that's this region here, which you would expect is going to get resected because you need to go, if you know your neuroanatomy, you'll go through the temporal pole to get to the amygdala and the hippocampus. So it's broadly similar. What I was hoping for when I did this analysis was these are good outcome because you've done a bigger resection and got these, and these are poor outcome and something like that. So the idea was to see if these volumes or connections related to outcome. So this is showing what connections were removed by surgery. And then the next question is, are any of these useful for predicting outcome? So we did a machine learning approach here. I'm not going into the details of it, to combine the connections to make a prediction of whether the patient was going to be seizure-free or not. And we found that, yeah, some combination of connections does explain outcome. To be honest, I wasn't massively convinced by this because we had many, many connections. We only had a sample size of 53. And I was hoping going into this that we find the golden connection where if you cut it, they'll be seizure-free. And if you don't cut it, they'll not be seizure-free. But nonetheless, we had a reasonable accuracy and sensitivity and specificity in this study. So to conclude or to summarize that study, and this was the start of the work that kind of followed really, structural networks may hold value for predicting outcome, and resections have different effects for different patients, so they're subtly different sizes, even for a standard approach. And accounting for the resection performed may be useful. However, like I say, I think that there was a lot of room for improvement on that study that we did. And that's why we did the next study of the 3 that I will talk to you about today. And this study incorporated abnormalities in the brain. So the motivation was that the previous study didn't account for abnormalities. So it was essentially just saying, if I could cut this connection, will the patient be seizure free or not? But actually, we probably want to consider if that connection was abnormal in the first place. Previous study didn't incorporate that knowledge, but this one that I'm about to show you does. The previous study also only looked at 12-month outcomes, and as I showed you right at the beginning, many patients may be initially seizure-free after 12 months, but then deteriorate at a later date. So that was a limitation. It also treated outcome as a binary measure, seizure-free or not, whereas there are different severities of outcome. And it also looked at the change in the network rather than what remained. And when you think about it, after the surgery, some patients are seizing, some patients are not. And so there's where you should be able to find the difference, right? Oh, that was our thinking. So what we did in this study was to, for each connection in our connectivity matrix derived from diffusion imaging, we Z-scored that connection in patients relative to controls. And that connection then essentially had an abnormality. And we postulated that regions with many abnormal connections going to it, they were pathological and they were causing seizures. And so the hypothesis that we had was in the post-operative network, which we can infer given a pre-operative network and a mask of the resection, in a post-operative network, we postulated, or we hypothesized that if there's many abnormal nodes remaining in the network, then patients would have poorer outcomes. So they would not be seizure-free. And just to say, we classified good and bad as seizure-free and still having some degree of seizures in the first instance. So in this kind of pseudo post-operative network, abnormality network, we did find indeed that this alone corresponds with outcome. So I've got a couple of example patients here. This patient was a good outcome at year 1, seizure-free, completely seizure-free, and they had very few abnormal nodes. And an abnormal node is defined as a region with abnormal connections to it. So this brain of this patient post-operatively looks very normal. In contrast, this patient looked very abnormal, and this patient had continuous seizures after the operation, even within the first year, so straight away they relapsed. Surgery was ineffective for this patient. That was just 2 patients. There's another 2 patients in the middle plotted here, and these were also initially good outcome at 12 months. But you'll notice that this one, patient 39, looks substantially worse in terms of the abnormality profile. And I'll come back to that in a second. But we have multiple patients with good outcomes and also some patients with bad outcomes. And overall, we found a trend that patients with poorer outcomes had more abnormal brains post-operatively, or expected post-operatively. I'll come back to this patient. This patient looked initially post-operatively more abnormal than this one, despite the fact that they were both good outcome. At year 2, they actually relapsed, so they continued to have seizures afterwards. And in contrast to that, these 2 patients who looked more normal did not relapse to seizures. Now, you would expect this, given the fact that this patient had many more abnormalities and these 2 patients didn't. Hello?
So, you might have said this and I might have missed it, but so were these abnormalities measured before or after the surgery?
Before.
Okay.
Yeah. So, sorry, I've not made that clear at all. Okay. So, pre-operatively, we do the diffusion imaging scan, construct the connectome, remove the regions which are subsequently resected, because you could do that pseudo prospectively, right? You just remove whatever you intend to resect and look at everything else that's left.
I mean, it might be interesting post-operatively, but obviously pre-operative makes more sense.
Show a slide on post-op.
Okay, cool.
This was a nice result because initially when you look at this data, you would think, we're not doing so well with this patient, but actually it kind of makes sense when you look at the data and see that the patient relapsed. And of course, this patient continued to have seizures for many years later. And on a group level, what we did is we combined these 2 groups. So ILE2 means that you're still having seizures, but they are not convulsive seizures. So that's actually still borderline, maybe a good outcome for the patient. But what we did is we combined these two kind of goodish outcomes and then looked if they relapsed at a later year. And indeed, across this cohort, the ones that did relapse were generally more abnormal than those who didn't, even though they were seizure-free at year 1. So this plot here, panel G, is only plotting the patients, the subset of patients that are in green here, which you would expect, which would hypothesize. So it's like a further validation, if you like. And then what we did with that, that's just one number per patient, right? That's just an abnormality load, it's a number. And what we did with that is we took that and put it into a support vector machine along with a load of other clinical demographic metrics and predicted outcome using a leave one out classifier. And we evaluated the feature importance, and the best model that came out included these features and did recursive feature elimination. And you'll notice that the surgically spared network, so this expected post-operative abnormality load, that was the top ranking feature every time and contributed to the most to the predictions. And we had a pretty good prediction performance of AUC 0.91, which is better than most in the literature, to be honest with you. And what you get with this is you get a probability. So it's essentially how far you are from the hyperplane of the SVM to say whether you're far away or close to it. And if you're close to it, then we're maybe not so confident in the prediction. But if you're far away, then we're pretty confident that you're going to be seizure-free or not seizure-free. And what we did is we related that prediction probability essentially to the grade of outcome. And like I say, ILE 1 is what you want to aim for, that's complete seizure freedom. ILE 5 is no improvement whatsoever. And everything else is kind of like a grade in the middle. And we found a correlation here with this prediction probability, which was not built into the model. So that was another nice validation. And hence the exclamation mark after that, because we didn't build that into the model. So to conclude some of the things on that study, I would say accounting for abnormality and resection information together improves predictions of outcome. And prior to this study, I mean, it might sound simple, obvious when you think about it, especially for some of the complex analyses that were presented this morning, but that hadn't been done in the literature, that hadn't really been shown. Incorporating clinical and demographic information further improves predictions, but to be honest, not massively above what we were doing already. And considering the spectrum of outcomes and relapse at later years, again, not built into the model, is possible.
Do I understand correctly that you reconstructed the connectivity of the brain just from the MRIs?
Yes, correct.
And is that actually neuron to neuron or some regions, or what's the resolution? How many?
It's regional. The MRI is something like 2 millimeter isotropic, so that gives you an idea of the scale. You get sub-millimeter tracks from diffusion imaging tractography. But we're talking macroscopic scale here. We're not talking individual single neurons. Does that answer your question?
I guess kind of, and how many regions are there?
So we replicated it for different parcellations. The one that I've shown the results for in this presentation had 128 regions. We did replicate that across parcellations up to and including 462 regions. I can't remember the numbers right. Hello.
So I also had a question in that direction, but maybe even more basic. So what do you mean by reconstructing the connectivity? You mean functional connectivity or actual connections between neurons? So what out from the signal that you measure reconstruct this connectivity? I don't understand.
Yeah. So this is diffusion weighted MRI. So it's an MRI scan. So we're talking macroscopic level, and it's structural imaging, and you can imagine it as being the connections in the white matter between the grey matter areas on a very coarse scale. There's lots of limitations with diffusion MRI, which is probably a conversation for another time, but coarse scale macroscopic connectivity between brain regions at the multiple centimeter spatial resolution. and this is structural connectivity. So white matter connections between grey matter that can be opposite hemispheres. And
I see. Thanks.
So, another question: do you have any insight on the origin of these abnormal connections? Because one could think that, oh, I have abnormal connections, and then this facilitates having these seizures. Or maybe it could be that you have these seizures, and through synaptic plasticity, then abnormal connections are formed. So I don't know if you have some idea in which of these two is more probable, or maybe it's a combination of both.
yeah, great question. Then there's also the medication effect. So is the medication affecting the connectivity? Because if you've got somebody who's been taking medication for many years, then if medication affects white matter connectivity, then that's also going to be a factor, right? So you make a great point. The short answer is we don't really know. The slightly longer answer, and I'm conscious of time, the slightly longer answer is we need longitudinal studies to investigate that, and we need studies of patients with new onset epilepsy before they've even had medication. So when they present to the clinician at the hospital on first seizure, before they've even been diagnosed, we need data sets where it's acquired at that point, and then we can, again, longitudinally tell if medication is affecting this. We need seizure diary, accurate seizure diaries, probably through wearables like a Fitbit, to say whether the patient's having regular seizures or rare seizures, and then we can correlate that against the abnormality. So that's a slightly longer answer. Short answer is we don't know. Long answer is there's people working on that, but it's not easy getting these people to come back longitudinally. It's not easy to study.
I think it's, at least in some patient classes, you do see increase of these foci if they have seizures. So seizures could promote seizures and make things worse.
So it's a contentious debate, that.
Yeah.
Seizures beget seizures. Yeah. I don't think I want to get into that debate, right? Hello.
A follow-up to your first answer. So you did the different parcellation levels. Why did you choose the 120? Was it better results for the 120, or was it about the same? Excuse me, all the way up to 400? Or?
Yeah, good question. It was roughly the same, to be honest with you. We didn't cherry pick it. You might not believe it, but we didn't. It was basically the case of if you used a really low resolution parcellation scheme, then it's kind of too coarse. You don't get the granularity of it. And if you use a really high parcellation scheme, then what is temporal pole subsection 3 in one subject might not be temporal pole subsection 3 in another subject because of the registrations. It might just be misaligned. So we pick something in the middle, partly just because it's the easiest to defend. But to be honest with you, it actually doesn't make a lot of difference. I'm quite pragmatic on that. Hello.
But I mean, coming back to the sort of neuroplasticity question, just the fact that they slowly get worse over year time scale indicates there is a component of neuroplasticity. Of course, you don't know what is the background of that. But I guess you're assuming that the worse they look today, the worse that background process could be, that in the future leads to more epilepsy.
I mean, in some cases, I think you're almost certainly right. In other cases, I think it can be very different. So there's certainly cases where people grow out of their epilepsy, especially in teenage years, for example. It can be quite common in teenage years to get JME, juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, and then something like half or a quarter of patients, they'll grow out of that in their 20s. And there's good evidence in the literature of abnormalities in JME, and then they grow out of it. So I think it's really not a simple thing to look into. I think we need really good quality longitudinal data from first seizure onset, and ideally before first seizure even presents, but it's not going to happen. But yeah, great questions and good discussion. Thank you. Right, I'll move on to the final study. So we've talked a lot about MRI and diffusion imaging so far. Another tool in the arsenal of the clinicians, if you like, is to record neurophysiological data from patients with epilepsy. And so that's EEG, MEG, that kind of thing. And in particular in epilepsy, because they're thinking of doing a resection anyway, often patients will have invasive electrode recordings. So this is opening up the skull. Oh, I'll just go to this slide. This is opening up, doing a surgery to open up the skull, remove it. You put either a grid on there or you put depth electrodes into the brain, and you record directly from the grey matter or white matter, wherever the electrode is. And so this is the kind of data that I'm going to be talking about in this final part of my talk. So the motivation is that abnormality, this kind of notion of abnormality, seems to be useful, at least in imaging in MRI. So maybe we want to transfer that to neurophys recordings. I would also say considering the resection seems to be useful, and abnormality is not quantitatively used typically for intracranial data, because it's very difficult to get a sense of what is normal, because you wouldn't go implanting these electrodes in healthy people. So the previous studies, right, I've had healthy controls as my baseline. You're not going to be able to put electrodes in healthy people. So how do we get around that? So the way that we've got around that is to amass an absolutely massive data set of data from 234 patients with epilepsy who've had electrodes implanted into the brain, but we've removed any electrode contacts that were either in the seizure onset zone or the spread of the seizure onset, if you like. And so we're looking at kind of pseudo-healthy recordings from these patients, from 234 patients. And what we did is for each electrode contact, it has a time series associated with it, which is the recording. And for each one of those, we computed the log relative band power. It's relative band power, so it sums to 1. And so in order to do this, you need a massive cohort, because the implantation of the electrodes in an individual doesn't cover the whole brain, because you've got to be really selective about where you put these depth electrodes. And so for one subject, it might look like that. And for another subject, it might look like that. But with our massive data set of 200 odd subjects, we actually ultimately get really good coverage of all brain areas. And we use that as our baseline to which we can compare to get abnormalities. And so what we do is we localize each and every single electrode to a brain region. So again, 128 brain regions, but we replicated across past lesions. And we get the relative band power, so that from the paraspectral density. So I think somebody's talking about FOOF tomorrow on paraspectral densities. So if that person's here, come say hello. But we look at the PSD, compute the relative band power in each of the different frequency bands in a given brain region. So in this region, you can see there's a lot of power in delta, low frequency, and much less power in gamma. And you can see delta on average across our subjects that are implanted in this region is about 0.22-ish. And that's this region back here. And then what we did on the next slide is to just plot this across space. So if you think 0.22 around here, 0.22 is a very pale color. That's here. That's essentially what's plotted. And you can see some pretty striking profiles coming out from this cohort. So you can see strong alpha activity in parietal and occipital regions, and strong delta in anterior temporal, inferior frontal regions. And when we compare that to the literature, so this is a MEG study done in healthy controls, we can see very similar spatial profiles. So we see strong alpha occipitally, strong delta in anterior temporal and inferior frontal areas. So this gives us some confidence that even though our normative intracranial map is from patients, it's representing something similar to controls and somewhat healthy. And so that is from the literature. We've also reproduced that in our own MEG data, and that was published earlier this year. So once we've got this normative map, essentially a distribution of data from what we can consider as our controls, we can compare an individual patient to that. And this patient is from a totally different site, wasn't included in the construction of the normative map, and they had depth electrodes implanted in the temporal, parietal, and occipital areas. And when localized to regions, it looks like this. And for an example region, the left middle temporal gyrus, it's not abnormal in any of the frequency bands really. It's within a Z-score of almost 1. Whereas in the left lateral occipital gyrus, it's very abnormal in the theta frequency. It's got very, very high theta relative to what you would expect in the normative map. And so what we do next is to essentially just take the maximum abnormality of any of the frequency bands and plot that in space. And we can see that this region here, which has this abnormality of Z-score 2.99, is very red, whereas this one is very orange, so not very abnormal at all. And what we did next is to overlay the resection mask of what was actually done after the intracranial recording in this patient. And we hypothesized that this patient, if these red regions were resected, would be a good outcome. So they'd be seizure-free afterwards. And I guess I wouldn't be telling you this if that weren't the case. So this patient was ILE1, seizure-free afterwards. And the most abnormal regions here were indeed resected. That's the post-operative scan. There you can see the hole in the brain, if you like. And when we compute the difference between the resected and the spared in terms of their abnormality, we can see a significant increase in abnormality in the resection. Here's another patient. So this patient was ILE4 and had continuous seizures after the operation, even after a massive frontal lobe resection. And you can see that actually the most abnormal regions were more posterior to that, so in somatomotor areas. And so this patient in the spared tissue was much more abnormal than in the resection. And we expect that this explains why they were still having seizures afterwards. So this is 2 example patients. We looked at this across the cohort and we quantified this with the DRS metric. So this is the difference essentially between the resection and the spared. And if this equals 0, then that means all resected are more abnormal than all spared. And if this equals 1, it means all spared are more abnormal than all resected. It's essentially an AUC. And across the cohort, we found that indeed this is predictive of outcome, with the spared being much more abnormal in the poor outcome patients with persistent seizures, with an AUC of about 0.75. And I should just stress that we're looking at interictal data here. So this is not data from where the patients are actually seizing. This is just their resting state data. So this is usually disregarded by the clinical teams. The clinical teams are looking to find times when the patient is seizing and trying to use that as localizing information. So considering that this is usually disregarded data, I think we're doing pretty well here. We also managed to reproduce that for different time segments, because you could say, okay, you just pulled out the best time when this works, but no, it also holds over other segments and different parcellation schemes, whoever asked that. Hello.
But can you make this prescriptive? Like you showed that some section was removed in which there were no normal connections, and if it was noticed that there are a lot of abnormal connections somewhere, then would you suggest to the surgeon remove this part of the brain? Wouldn't that conflict?
Precisely. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Yes. Just send my next grant to you. Hello.
Now that you answer the questions again. I was wondering, you found it in this theta band.
Yep.
Yeah. And I know from epilepsy that you have in the interictal activity even these epileptiform spikes.
Yep.
That are not nice oscillations, but they are like little dents in the
Absolutely.
signal. And I thought that they like ride a bit on theta or have themselves theta rhythmic characteristics. So I'm wondering, if you look at the signals, is it so that you have higher original oscillations, or is it that you have just epileptic spikes sitting in this region who happen to present as theta in the spectrogram?
Great question. And that was actually one of the questions the reviewers of the paper asked. We looked at that in a lot of detail, because that's one of the things that the clinicians look at. Are there persistent spikes interictally in this region? So there's a few ways in which we address that. The short answer is it doesn't matter. The long answer is we can take a normal segment and add artificial spikes and see if it changes the abnormality massively. And it doesn't. And there's a section in the paper on that. We also, in addition to that, had a look at patients who had spikes and patients who didn't have spikes, and their spike frequency and location, to see if that correlated in particular frequency bands, like you say, with the abnormality loads. And we found that, about 5 minutes. That's fine. And we found that the clinicians were resecting spikes more often than by chance, but that didn't explain outcome. That makes sense.
You would say it's a genuine theta oscillation.
So the changes that we see in our results are lots of different frequency bands. This is a hidden slide, but it's all over the place. It's not one particular frequency band that's driving our results.
It could also be just the transients from the spikes, right? Because they present in all different, but you normalize for the whole spectrum.
Yeah, so if it was that, then the resection of spikes would predict outcome, and it doesn't. But great question. Fair point. Yeah. Oh, we're on that one. Yep. So these are reproduced across different segments and different parcellations. And also, just as a signature, we managed to reproduce these results in MEG data as well. So this is a patient, we used exactly the same methods of relative band power. This is a patient who was seizure-free, and you can see the abnormality map, and it overlapped with the resection. And a patient that wasn't seizure-free, and we would expect that resection should have been done here. And that explained outcome with a similar AUC. So we're pretty confident in these methods. So to summarize study 3, intracranial normative map that we've shown here, as far as I'm aware, it's the largest of its kind, and it agrees with previous data, and that's open access. You can access that map if you're interested in it. Interictal abnormalities hold value for predicting outcome above and beyond spikes, and abnormalities are in different frequency bands in different locations, and this suggests substantial heterogeneity in epilepsy. So if I have just a couple of minutes, I'd like to just kind of bring this all back together full circle, if that's okay. So how can a computer scientist help a neurologist? Well, I would say that what's done currently is clinicians will acquire all this data. They'll have a meeting in the hospital, and between them, they'll have a discussion, and then they'll come up with a surgery, and they'll go ahead and do it. And what I would say is this should be an iterative process. This should feed in to the kind of algorithms that I've been presenting today and make predictions that can then be fed back to the clinical team in an iterative cycle, probably in some kind of a software tool. And so I'd like to demonstrate that with a case study. So what I've presented so far is the normative map, which is from the US, and the patient cohort from London. This patient is from a completely different center again, not included in any of the original studies. And this is an adult epilepsy patient. They had an implantation to the temporal and frontal lobes, and there was some debate about whether it should be a temporal or a frontal resection. And what we've done is we built a piece of software in order to interrogate these abnormalities and compute them. Let's see if this works. The demo of this software, if you believe me. There we go. And so this is the tool that we're using to communicate to the clinicians where the abnormalities are, how much they are, their location, making predictions of outcomes for given surgical strategies. And you can see this is the actual case that I've just described on the previous slide. And you can see this huge abnormality here in red where the crosshair is in the hippocampus and the amygdala. And actually this was later resected in this patient. And if this patient had been included in the original study, they would have been here, and so we would have been predicting a good outcome. And we look back on the case notes, and actually the patient was seizure-free and is now off medications and essentially cured of their epilepsy. So we're currently performing a multi-center retrospective study across 8 hospitals worldwide with over 500 patients. And we're also evaluating this prospectively using the software that I've just shown. So if you're interested in that, let me know. So with that, I'll close and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Any final question? Yes.
This is sort of an ignorant question, but like, so I guess if the surgery is you're cutting out a part of someone's brain, like how much does that tend to like affect them? So, you know, you say that, you say that a good outcome is you cut off a lot of their brain and then they don't have seizures, and that is good. But
so you remove the whole brain and they're definitely seizure-free.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that we're planning to do with this software is to develop it in a kind of a holistic approach. So not to just predict if you reset this brain region, you're going to be seizure-free, but to also incorporate knowledge of comorbidities and neurocognitive assessments to say if you reset this, you might be seizure-free, but you're going to have language impairments, you know, if you reset broca's area.
Yeah, because you have like this sort of grim optimization.
Exactly. So it's the software will go in a holistic manner. The first stage is to get the seizure freedom stuff. But a great question, and it totally depends on where the resection is.
So I have a question regarding, you presented the results first with MRI and then also with MEG. And as far as I understand, there is this trade-off between spatial and temporal resolution of both. So on one side, I wonder if you think for this kind of cases, it's better to have like better spatial resolution in order to identify where the possible abnormal areas, or maybe having better knowledge about the dynamics. And if this kind of approach will benefit from this modern, like combined fMRI plus MEG methods that people is using lately. I know they are not very widely available, but
Yeah, great question. So all of the data that I presented today was actually acquired for clinical purposes. So the clinical teams look at this data. You'll have a radiologist look at the MRI, you'll have a neurophysiologist look at the EEG, and then they get into a meeting in a room and they all discuss it, and it's basically the loudest voice wins on where is resected in the patient. I am proposing a quantitative approach to that, which incorporates all this as well. So in answer to your question, I don't think it's all our money's on MRI and we ignore everything else, or the other way around. I think everything is acquired for a reason, and therefore we should be incorporating everything into our solutions. And it'll probably be different for different patients as well. For one patient, it might be MRI, but not, yeah.
Do you know if we can combine the structural connectivity and the functional connectivity? I know that there exists, for instance, graph signal processing that can do that, and I was wondering how you could use, if you are thinking so.
Yeah. So there's, I mean, some of the people in this room will know better than me. There's things like multi-layer networks, things like that you can do. We've actually got a paper in press in neurology at the moment where we construct functional networks from intracranial data, just pairwise correlations between the time series, and structural networks from the diffusion imaging. And we correlate the two. And we actually found a stronger correlation in good outcome patients as opposed to poor outcome patients. So you can do things like that to look into integrating these modalities together. And then you can do whatever you like, right? Dimensionality reduction on that. So yeah, I think there's probably other talks on multi-layer networks for one thing coming up. I haven't seen the project, but yeah, I mean, I'm convinced that there is complementary information in the different modalities, and the best way to pull that out, I don't know. But that's the exciting part of the research, right? Great question.
All right, thank you, Jan.